Hello, and welcome back to the Power Podcast. It's been a while. Thank you for Sam and Alex joining us this time. How are you both doing?
Well, this week's been pretty hard. I mean, some guy just came up to me and just bit me on the arm, and I've been feeling a bit weird. So, it's probably nothing. I haven't seen a doctor.
Oh no.
I don't know. I just keep looking at my bite, and it gets like worse. And anyway, how are you doing?
People and think, you know what, they're pretty tasty, and not in the normal way.
I am a little hungry.
Also, every now and again I keep having blackout. I am all powerful and mighty. There is none who can stop me. Yeah, anyway, as I was saying.
Oh my god!
Wait.
Oh my god, he's got COVID!
What? Anyway.
Happens.
Moving on. So, yes, today we're going to be talking about a very interesting special because it is coming up to Halloween.
I've been pushing for this, I've got to be honest.
This is actually your baby, so would you like to do the intro to this particular power?
Oh no, the pressure. Well, I'll give it a go.
Okay.
Since my internet is hanging by a thread, I'll give it a go. Right. We're doing Undead Physiology, which is one of the physiologies where you are a dead person. You can be reanimated from the dead, or you can simply just stop being alive, but still have all the faculties of, still moving yourself despite being a corpse. And maybe having like higher pain thresholds, still going, even bits of your limbs are chopped off, just having all kinds of like, basically zombies, is one of the ways of saying it. I'm sorry if that's a terrible intro. I'm not used to this. The pressure was too much.
That's fine. That's absolutely fine. For those of you who might have not caught it, depending on the current internet and sound quality, Undead Physiology, and we'll say it again a million times, so don't worry if you missed it then when I said it, or previously when Alex said it, is basically exactly as Alex said it. Pretty much the main properties of this are the user has either the abilities of or can transform into an undead. Corporeal beings in mythology, legend, or fiction that are diseased or deceased, yet have the abilities to, or yet behave in a fashion as if they were alive. A common example is a corpse reanimated by supernatural forces, by the application of the deceased's own life force, or that of another being, such as a demon or other particular supernatural occurrences. Users with this power lack physical weaknesses such as pain, need to rest, vulnerability to environmental effects. The list goes on and on. While some still need to consume various substances, food, blood, flesh, life force, being clinically dead, their brains and bodies are immune to most powers that affect living beings. And this is where we get into the beautiful factors of this, because, my beautiful brethren, Undead is actually a form that can happen to anyone in the AnimiteTales so long as one of two powers, or specific unique attribute, can affect you.
What?
Ooh.
I already knew this.
I already knew this because technically I helped with creating it, says Alex, not says Joe.
Yeah.
Joe already knew this.
Just mock surprise. Please tell us more about this creator of game.
Sam is just confused Pikachu face.
So, we'll get into this real quick. Yes, it is zombies. No, it doesn't have to be just zombies. And yes, it is basically the Solomon Grundy thing. So we'll get right into this. First and foremost, invulnerability to environmental effects. That basically means the person doesn't have to worry too much about feeling pain, about frostbite, about feeling tired or overheated. Anything else? Any others that you might think of?
Oh no, you can't eat either. Well, I mean, you can
You don't
eat.
need to eat.
You
Although
don't have
you might
to.
need to eat something else.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends. It depends on the actual means by which they are made undead. Because, like, let's say they are just pure zombies without any intelligence. Generally, decompose a lot faster in hot conditions.
Yeah.
Become nothing, more or less.
Or even
So
their flesh becomes
environmental
basically chunked and damaged and falls off in low temperatures or extreme low temperatures.
Or both.
Yeah.
Like pressure hurts them, I'm assuming, because then they just explode.
I mean that
I'm
really
assuming they have a
depends.
slightly.
I was just thinking, like, they don't have to breathe. So, like in, I think City of the Dead, they can literally walk underwater on the bottom to get across to islands if they so choose.
Yeah,
if
but
they just keep on walking, and
Well, it would depend on how
they don't
far-
have to breathe. And well, I guess the pressure of space with them.
Depends on how far they go under the ocean as well, because
Also,
there's
don't
high
corpses
pressure
just-
down there. Remember, you can be crushed quite quickly
Oh, but
in that temperature.
question though, do corpses float though? This is the thing. You could literally just float, across the ocean because you don't
Some do.
you don't have to eat or anything. You just sit perfectly still.
I
Some
believe,
do,
if
some
I'm
don't,
remembering
so-
correctly, they say that
Yeah.
a corpse that's been decaying after a while eventually does float. Because it starts oxidizing. Bones, on the other hand, I believe can float.
Oh, that would be so nasty. You'd have to ooh.
Well, either way, we're gonna talk about this particularly because it's
basically, you'd
not
have to-
just zombies; it's also skeletons.
And
Bartholomew is
Just skeleton.
technically
Yeah.
an undead physiology user. And we've also had a couple of people playing as beings that are undead a couple of different times. However, I'm not talking about characters who have been brought back to life perfectly and are technically still living. I mean, as in their bodies are technically corpses. So, what do I mean by this? I mean, bleeding does not often usually damage them like it normally would. It just means that it will dry out their usual complexion or even just their body. Shooting them anywhere most likely doesn't damage them unless if they have been shot or damaged in enough places where it means that the body can no longer hold up. In other words, aim for the head. That's the best location of which that you can do. Although, be very cautious. Not all undeads have the same weaknesses as zombies. For instance, a skeleton might still be able to walk around even if its skull is destroyed if it is not technically controlled by a brain. And the same thing with zombies. So, now that we've got that out of the way, there's also two other things that I need to actually mention. Technically, it does not have to have the shape nor a form of a human. It can actually have the shape or a form of any living creature, or it just needs to be a semi-sentient object made out of what was once living flesh, but is no longer living flesh, and therefore is animated to do the bidding of whoever has summoned thee. So now that we have that out of the way, let's talk ups and downsides. Let's go with upsides first. What do you have on the table?
Well, my favourite one is the... No! This is mine! Get out of here!
This is mine! Oh my!
5 seconds in the rest of us are I don't know when you're going to speak.
Don't you guys know that this is my show, and then whoever I allow to... No, go on.
Alex.
I'm so sorry. No, I was just gonna say, like, the inability to feel pain, or at least not as much pain, like arms and legs ripped off, and just like get shot many times, but it doesn't matter. Like, just keep going.
I'll get into pain immunity in a little bit later, because theoretically that is both an up and a downside, but we'll get into that later. So go on. Any others?
I mean, it mostly
I guess the ability
depends.
to intimidate.
Okay. Although, that really depends. If some people found out that there was a way that some people could become undead, they might think quickly enough to go, oh, cool. So if you have some level of sentience or intelligence, I would potentially also gain mine back, so I don't have to worry about gaining a second form of immortality.
To which the zombie says, "Damn it. God damn it."
Anything for you, Sam?
I don't know if Ox is going to try begin talking again, so I might wait some more. Before I have to cut off and come back again.
You are free.
Mine, thank you. Can I have the teddy bear of speech?
Yeah.
You are given the teddy bear of speech.
Yes.
It grossly depends on the form in which they are undead, is what I was going to say. Because some undead zombies have the bonuses of mostly being dumb, or the great downside being eternal hunger. Again, they're a great variation of zombies. There's zombies that are hyper intelligent or have the same intelligence. In the Marvel the Marvel zombies, they are the same but zombies. But they're other undead that aren't zombies. They're liches. They're undead, but are magic, more or less magic bones brought back from the dead that are intelligent, cannot be killed, or if they can be killed, you have to destroy an object far away. They have extreme magical powers. I think they have just have an aura of fear around them. People around just feel afraid.
Not all of them, but a large portion of them that are considered enemies do. But go on.
There's vampires as well, which are undead. They tend to have supernatural powers.
That is another thing. Yeah, I'm sorry. I have to humbly apologise. It is not just zombies and skeletons. Vampires also count as this. I humbly apologise, Sam, considering that we have been building a vampire unique attribute for your character of a next campaign.
Yeah. And whenever they become from mortal to vampire, they gain a wide array of special powers, like mind control and turning into bats, like fog, and they have a wide range of powers. The Vampire the Masquerade also gives them super cool powers, and they actually do have rules about going into cold temperatures when they will actually freeze and pass out. That's the one downside, is they can't feel the cold, so they don't actually know when they are beginning to freeze internally.
Until they start losing levels of their consciousness.
No, they just begin to get quite sleepy and just enter torpor and more or less cannot be revived.
Wait, there was those vampires in Skyrim as well, where they would literally hide in ice lakes and just get travelers to just come around, and they would just leap out seals and then get them under the ice, and the ice would freeze over, and they would just happily feed underneath there, and no one would ever detect them. Just completely undetectable because they've got no heat signatures.
They've got no life signature.
No, breathing. Yeah, not exactly. Yeah. So they've got.
So there's so many different things that couldn't sense them.
Yeah.
So that's another upside. Yeah. They don't get sensed by life sensors, nor do they get sensed by heat signatures. This is all three of them: vampirism, zombification, or even just sentient skeletons. Which is another particular thing as to what I was going to bring back about Bartholomew, which is obviously because he was purely bones, he didn't have any muscles weighing him down. And I'm going to argue this. I've already argued this before about living sentient objects. If an object could move as if it was able to move like a normal human being, even moving as if it was normal, say for instance a stone statue suddenly started moving, that thing technically could have physically larger strength than anyone else in the world, because if it had the ability to, say for instance, move its arms around as freely as you can, that is metal that has a tensile strength way greater than your physical flesh does, meaning that it could go for an arm wrestle. And at any point, it could just go, no, I'm just going to have my arm stiff for a second. And you wouldn't be able to bend it, because unless if you could bend solid steel that is the same width as your own arm, or larger, there is no way that you could move it. So yeah, technically skeletons is obviously a really bad example, but the opposite is actually said for them. If they could actually have all of their body parts attached either through magical magnetics of some sort, or even some kind of odd form of sinew that still continues to keep the ligaments together, you can actually have it that, like, because of that, they're actually extraordinarily light and therefore could move faster and jump higher, because if they still have the same strength as anyone else, that technically means that their jump would at least be double, if not triple, because most of their body weight is gone. They don't have organs, they don't have muscles, they don't have fat. Gone. Second, if they're able to see without eyeballs, there's a theoretical possibility that they could see without the requirement of light, which is what Bartholomew was given, and technically all bone thropials. So technically that also means that that's another upside. Certain undead can see in the dark regardless as well. So this really comes down to a multiple set of factors. It almost seems like as if being an undead or having undead physiology, regardless of whether you can transform into it or it's permanently a thing that you are because you're a living sentient zombie or you just are a zombie or a skeleton, the interesting thing is it seems almost as if you have more upsides than downsides. However...
Man, no.
However...
He's getting to that.
What are the downsides that you could possibly see in this, I'm gonna say, near-perfect form?
Well, first of all, you're dead. That's kind of a big one. You're dead. Like it's dead. You smell. You're decomposing. You know, you don't have any of the benefits of life. Like you're like fucking. I would be mad. As much as I love, the undead as a concept, I would go mad as an undead. I would be like Barbossa in Pirates of the Caribbean. It's like I'm just going mad over the taste of an apple. It's just, it's like, oh, I can't enjoy all of these things that I've enjoyed all these years. Oh, I guess I'll just have to captain a pirate ship and try and get myself undeaded. That would be my reaction to it. And like, that sucks. Like, it's like, oh, what's the point?
Okay, so lots of senses, lots of sensations, lots of taste.
Also, I get like, motivation as well. Like, if you're like,
Potentially.
once you're dead, it's potentially. That's possible.
I mean, you could always be just living, only having the memories of your previous life, and just being like, and the main reason that you gain less and less motivation could be very well because your body is still decaying, because here's another downside. Your body might still be decaying, and honestly, you got a couple of years at best, because weather does not exactly weather the body very well. The condition would eventually decay, and again, unless if you've got the lucky sun gun version of Undead where you don't decay, you just got the dead body and that's it, you are pretty much screwed, because eventually your body's going to rot and destroy itself from the inside and out. You'll fall apart, your organs will basically be rotten, maggots might start living in you after a while.
The worst part is that you're conscious through all of that. Like, these things would be bad if, like, you weren't conscious, if you were just, like, a puppet or, just being puppeteered about.
If
no
you're
knowledge,
not...
but know it.
If you're not sure on exactly whether or not this power is good or bad, and you still don't think that any of those are a bad side, which I don't know how you would have listened to what the two of us have just said and not think that that's a bad side, watch American Gods first and second season, and you tell me in the comments that you still think that being an undead physiology user is not a bad side. Because if you only have a few months to live, even after you've just died, and you're starting to smell and rot and have basically a host of new problems, good for you. Any other downsides?
I'll let Sam.
I'll let Sam go. Yeah.
Teddy again.
Well, I'm. You know the way I like mythology. I can bring up one example here.
Okay.
You're forced to go. You're forced to rule hell, or the equivalent of, because in Egyptian there was a god called Osiris. Actually, he was meant to be resurrected, but one of the gods called Set stole his heart, I think. He just remained dead. And because he was dead, he decided, well, I'm going to take over the underworld now. There's that. So it means you have to rule over the underworld, which is a bit cack.
That's only if you're a god. Osiris was a god of justice.
I know, but Egyptians gods died a lot. They were not immortal like other gods.
I think I know what you're getting at here, though. It's like you are kind of like forced to be aligned with the unliving, because like the living don't really want you around.
Yeah.
So you're just basically like, yeah.
You're not they don't want you back up there with the other gods because you're the dead god. You're daddy god.
Okay, well, so
I do have other ones, other bad things.
Okay, go on.
Mostly because we've talked about zombies, I can do the vampires one.
Yeah, go for it.
I can't mention one zombie one. That is, you're controlled by an extra-dimensional plane. That's the D&D one, where they're actually fed by extra-dimensional plane of undeath, which means that their body composes to a certain level and then just stops composing and stops adjusting until you cut it to pieces. Like, vampires have a whole host of bad things. Even, like, depending on what myth you go by, sunlight hurts them. Reasons. Can't see themselves in mirrors. Holding objects hurt them. And that does happen to some zombies as well, depending on the myth. And a whole host of other downsides.
So another particular downside that you would specifically state is potentially divine or holy objects. Sunlight,
Yes.
This is actually another one. Sunlight does affect certain zombies or undead. Not just necessarily certain vampires, but it can also affect certain other forms of undead. As a matter of fact, there was actually a question that someone had for me. I can't remember if it was you or someone else. Someone asked me, is the reason why we're doing all of the villain campaign at night time because that Bartholomew can't survive in sunlight? Which is a strange question, because I think only the first mission, which was not streamed, well, it technically was streamed, but it was never posted to YouTube because things happened. Someone asked me in the team, is the only reason as to why we're in darkness because that Bartholomew would actually die in sunlight? I was just like, no. And then I actually looked this up. Certain skeletons can actually lose their animation or even burn and turn into dust in certain forms of mythology and legends. Like Draugr. There's one specific legend of a Draugr that actually disintegrated upon sunlight touching it. But weirdly enough, I haven't really seen too much of that, because not all Draugr have that. You know, not only just in Skyrim, but in Norse mythology. So it's kind of weird that, like, zombie skeletons and even vampires, not all of them are affected by sunlight, but some of them can be. So again, really interesting. Obviously, holy objects, divine power.
Just like, do you think it's because of, like, you know, it's because their association with magic? They think that, oh yeah, well, light defeats dark, so therefore that's the implication there.
Okay, well,
I think isn't it to do also with holiness?
Yes, it is because technically those that are undead, or at least are moving around, I guess you could. Here's my theory on this. It's either because that it's unholy for a body to be able to move without a god's power granting it back power. In other words, an unnatural force, a demon, a monster, a devil, or even humans figuring out a way to do it. Because again, old forms of religion believe that unless if a god was specifically allowing death to be defined, it's technically unholy because it's against the. It's basically a defiance of God. But another particular one that also could be stated as technically anything that was not explicable, in other words, through means of science, was actually considered to be unholy. So technically, it would be the same way as a form of holiness, in other words, meaning a higher being allowing it to be so, or disallowing it to be so, would actually specifically be the concept as to whether or not it could actually be harmed by other gods. In one particular one, I don't know what it was, I cannot remember where it came from, but there's a specific thing where a person was cursed with immortality or undead, because their heart didn't move or whatever, and they basically sort of still had rotten flesh, but it wouldn't rot any further. They could take holy damage, but later on they found out that holy did not work with another god. And it was purely because that this particular god that they took damage from actually stated that it was against basically it was against their will that this person was to be brought back to life. So again, could be a particular other downside that all or some gods / some people who rectify the specific aspects of the gods actually cannot affect them. Now, here's a funny thing. No, go on.
They all seem to have a hunger as well. Quite a lot of them seem to have this kind of overwhelming hunger.
Yes. Now, I was going to get into that in a second, but I was actually going to say, here's a funny thing about the pain management system.
Here we go.
And
so obviously, everyone who ever felt a large amount of pain in their life, thinking, "Man, if only this could just be gone for the amount of time that I'm supposed to endure this, that would be great." The undead don't feel pain, or at least most of them don't feel pain. Well, here's the problem. If they can't feel pain, some of them can sustain injuries and not even know about it. For instance, broken arms, broken legs, shattered ribs, or even destroyed spinal columns. Hell, even shattered skulls. They might have severe injuries and not know about it until it's too late. For instance, a shattered arm, and they try and throw a punch, and their entire arm is just basically bursts because all of the bone fragments just shoot out everywhere. Or a shattered spinal column, and they try to move, and suddenly the entirety of their top or a certain part of their body just suddenly folds in on itself because it's forcing itself to move, and there's no nerve endings basically telling them this is not possible. So in other words, they're pushing the body to their absolute limits. Heck, they could even tear apart parts of their own flesh doing so because their body does not send them signals saying this should not be happening, stop doing this.
The greatest one,
that is a real thing that happens.
I was about
people
to say,
with isn't it the medical term SEPA? It's like a medical issue. Basically, there's a medical
don't feel pain.
Yeah, basically they don't feel pain. Which is bad, but the thing is that a lot of them can have such an extreme of not being able to feel anything. Some of them have the factor of that they don't get sent pain signals when their bodies should be taking pain, but they might feel something. For instance, they might just, that is pressure, but what their body isn't telling them is, that's not pressure. That is heat melting your hand or burning your flesh. And it's like, that's interesting pressure. Look at it, and it's basically a 3rd-degree burn on their hand. And
imagine being on fire and not noticing it until the flesh has completely burnt off your bones.
Yeah.
That's a problem.
Yeah.
Or you've just been spreading the fire around your room because you've just just casually been set on fire and not notice it because you have no pain receptors.
I'm eyes in my Ants Johnson. I can't see anything, everything's black. I also don't feel any pain, but that's not catchy, so it usually goes by the wayside.
I mean, upside though, quite a few of them seem to have regenerative capabilities, so them not being able to feel pain doesn't matter to them as such.
Some,
it's
but not
my
all.
arm's gone, now it's back. Some of them do. I know zombies in D&D, they do. Vampires tend to.
Well, vampires, yes.
Zombies in pop culture don't often have regenerative healing factors.
Yeah.
And they tend to be kind of science. I don't really know how zombies are made scientifically. Some kind of weird disease.
Usually, it's some kind of infection or parasite that is basically causing the brain stem to basically reanimate parts of the nervous system, forcing the body to move. And I mean, the two different ones that we've seen, the virus, and if anyone's ever seen, heard, or played the Dead Rising games, it's actually a larvae that is inside of the brainstem and basically pilots the rest of the body like a mech. And it uses all of the sensors to figure out where it's supposed to be. It can use its senses of smell and taste, and basically it keeps feeding it. But any of the nutrients that are supposed to be running through it it doesn't ever know, because the only reason as to why it's hungry is because the larvae is also sending out the same sensors of hunger, hunger, hunger. So it's sending out the same sensors, hence why when the zombies grab people, they always bite them, because they're hungry. But it's actually the larvae that is accidentally sending out that sensor of hungry, hungry, hungry. What it's doing is it's actually noshing at the flesh inside of the skull until eventually it pupates and eventually evolves into a wasp.
Because that is another interesting thing about undead. They seem to, instead of procreating the normal way, they seem to procreate by more or less infecting another. Like with zombies,
that's what makes them scary.
If they bite you, they just no, but that seems to be like the weird opposite of like zombies just have to bite you. Like you don't have to wait till you're dead.
Same with vampires, though.
You just have to bite you and then you become. And vampires.
Well, certain types of vampires, because certain types of vampires can bite you and it doesn't do anything. Other types of vampires, it's like, oh, I bit you and that's it. I mean, we'll get more into it because at some point I wouldn't mind talking about vampire physiology.
Oh hell yeah.
But obviously, probably next Halloween. Ah, dude, we have to get a coin on for that. Although I think coin will take over more than I do.
Won't hear anything else but Vampire the Masquerade, which I'd probably be voice of as well. I do Dracula, he'd do Vampire the Masquerade, and you'd do some One Piece character, I'm assuming.
No, come on, man, give me more credit. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure in Hellsing. Come on now.
Hellsing is good. Hellsing I would
good.
Accept as a reference. Hellsing's a good reference.
Hellsing is a good
Except
reference.
for the Nazi vampires. I just didn't.
Dude, I mean, like, you know what? We'll just move on. So, either way, the undead have many different upsides, many different downsides. Some that we didn't actually necessarily get to straight away, but here we go. So, undead, they have lots of different upsides and downsides. Usually, they are considered as semi-immortal, considering that bullet wounds don't affect them, bleeding them out or drowning them isn't going to usually work. However, skeletons and zombies have different weaknesses. For instance, a zombie might have the weakness of it requires all the flesh for it to work, otherwise it's just skeletal and then it just falls to pieces, because usually zombies often operate on the flesh part. However, skeletons, they don't have such weaknesses. So they usually tend to alter based off the factor of, having all these different other things. Like, for instance, they have weaknesses to holy damage a little bit more than maybe flesh creatures. Or maybe they have less health because there's not as much flesh on them, fat on them, organs inside them, or so on and so forth. Other particular ones could also base itself on, well, they don't have as much of a defensive rating because they don't have nice chunky skin armor and flesh armor to go around. They don't have muscles.
Have you ever seen a skeleton in any video game? You could just take them down with a single sword.
I mean, yes, although, that is true. I don't have any argument against that. That is true.
Well, I think you're going to go for, the D&D thing of, you can't pierce a skeleton with a rapier, can you? Skeletons take, you can be bashed with something, but they can't really slash a skeleton, can you? It's going to be... You can't really pierce it. Nor would, you can't really do much blunt damage to a zombie, can you? Because, bam! Okay, well, you've caved its skull in. Big whip. You've crushed its arm. What's that going to do to stop a zombie?
Yeah, that's true.
To be honest, I thought you were going to go with that idea of you take different types of damage differently.
No, they definitely do. I mean, well, they can
physically
do it.
Speaking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it has to be damaging the actual bones. This is the thing, isn't it? I mean, it is illogical. These creatures, they shouldn't exist by any form of logic, but they follow sort of logic. You kill a skeleton by breaking its bones because it's made of bones, and you kill a zombie by affecting, I guess, it's just the opposite. It's just cutting off bits of its flesh because it's animated flesh. So
let's be honest, most of the time it is basically slightly magic. If not, it is maybe telepathic and telekinetic, which some would argue is basically magic. But I guess you could say. Oh no, go on.
Could you say possession, like the Deadites from Evil Dead? They tend to operate on dead bodies. Even when you cut them up,
I'd say so, because technically your power is to possess a body or a dead body, regardless of which you are now either in a body or you're in an undead body, and therefore you are technically piloting a dead body, therefore making it undead, because it's moving and operating as if it were alive. So yes, if that makes you feel any better about the choice that you just made there.
It's an undead mech, is what you're saying.
That's a theoretically
flesh mech.
Yeah, flesh mech. Technically, we're all flesh mechs.
Yes.
Oh, good lord. Yes. No. Yeah. Absolutely.
I do have a 10-minute sequence in the morning, followed by thrusters.
Anyway,
Sorry.
Moving on very swiftly. So we have quite a large amount of different bits and pieces in the terms of content to talk about. I'm going to say a couple of other I'm going to say weaknesses now. Well, obviously we said sunlight and holy, but I'm going to say decapitation is a big one, potentially. One weakness from all of us, let's say. So a weakness from Alex.
I suppose, well, we talked a lot about fire. I mean, a lot of undead, they don't have immunity to fire, or they get more double damage from fire. I guess, again, it's sort of with holy magic and stuff, it has that association, but also ain't nothing coming back from fire.
Okay.
It doesn't matter how much pain you can withstand, you're still gonna burn up.
Yeah, it's less third-degree burns and more just charcoal skin at this point.
Yeah, so that's a thing. That is a big weakness, and so things I keep finding in a lot of media about undead physiology. It's like fire is always the killer. It always cleanses.
Okay, Sam, what about you? A weakness?
Well, I was going to say, to be honest, I was going to say fire, damn it, but because I have to think of my own, I'm going to say necromancy actually tends to be a weakness of the undead.
Oh, really?
Usually, well, it depends on the undead. Usually, if they're dumb undead, you can just repossess them yourself. I'm gonna send my undead after you. Wait, no, they're mine now.
Oh, okay. I actually didn't think of it that way.
Or even, I don't think you can do this with the much more powerful ones, liches, but you could probably use it on vampires. At least in this game you could, because you've necrotized, because they're necrotized flesh as opposed to living flesh, so you could manually operate them, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah, necromancy has other spells. Turn undead as a necromancy spell where you force them to turn away from you. Don't like that.
That's true. Yeah, I mean, I've been playing quite a bit of Skyrim again recently, and yeah, that is true. It's a conjuration spell, and it counts as you get bonuses to necromancy if you use the ability to turn undead.
Yeah.
Not turn undead. Sorry, banish beings from another realm. Not turn undead. Turn undead is usually considered as a restoration or holy power. However, I might not necessarily be wrong in the factors of other things, considering, well, Skyrim does not base itself off of the same usual prospects of other powers. So, again, probably wrong.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm gonna say we'll get to this. We've now gotten to this part of the podcast where we usually talk about exactly what would we do if we were to have it. Now, I think this one is a little more different than usual, because obviously this is supposed to be a Halloween podcast, or at least this is supposed to be relatively themed around the time of spook. So instead of making it about what would you have if you had it, I'm going to say, oh no, Sam and Alex, you've both been bitten. What superpowers would you like to have to make your undead physiology much more scary or much more terrifying to deal with in a situation of being an undead with the powers of blank?
Ooh, this is the one. This is like I would have one that's quite similar to a vampire ability where I am completely dead, but I also have the ability to manipulate, my dead flow. I could literally like it's still gonna be gross and all like decaying and stuff, but I could literally just like manipulate my circulatory system to strangle people. Or like do the whole Ash versus the Evil Dead thing where I like get my intestines and like, grab onto people and like force them into my into my body. That is terrifying. And I'm like, that is if I had to have my one choice to absolutely make everybody take psychic damage from my undead form, that would be it.
So, in other words, self-biomass manipulation, but in this particular terms, it's self-necromass manipulation.
Yeah, basically.
Okay, terrifying. Giving yourself a level of healing capabilities in your own rights, but also having the ability to make it stunky, necrotized flesh that is cold and unfeeling. I like it. It's creepy, but it also works in the forms of a horror aspect. Okay.
Even better as well, if any bits fall off in the decaying process, I can still manipulate them, so I could literally just sort of, get my hand to like act like, a thing from the Addams Family and crawl around.
Okay.
Also, I'm just imagining Alex in the movie The Thing now.
I think we all can, because Alex does like to be like, if they ever have like creepy powers, they always like to be odd and cheeky with them.
I mean, you don't have to call me out like that in front of all these people.
It's less of a call out and more of like an homage to all of the times that you've ever had terrifying or interesting powers, and you've just made them either, if they're interesting, creepy, or if they're creepy, interesting. So that's more of an homage, and hats off to you. So take it however you like it, just not as an insult. Okay, Sam, what about you? If you could have any power with the undead physiology. Now, I'm going to say specifically, not vampirism. I'm going to actually say either being a skeleton or a zombie.
I do actually have a power.
Okay.
Admittedly, it is from a different thing, but I think it would work for this as well.
Okay.
Okay, this is a D&D power. Anti-paladins have the power, I think I've told you about this, where they have an aura of... probably have an aura of decay.
Like an aura of disease or decay, yeah.
Yeah, but probably both. Less it's just a zombie, but as it walks, like plants like wither and die around it.
Ooh.
Paint begins to not ripen, I guess. Paint whenever like begins to slough off the wall. Wood begins to just gnarl, and like the whole like thing begin to wither and die as you just move across it.
Okay, see, that is interesting. That is actually quite interesting.
Mold just begins to form around things and then like splotch out and die.
Okay.
Your sword just like rusts.
Ooh.
Actually, I mean that is a day thing.
So like an aura of decay, like quite literally, like a small area of proximity where things start taking decay damage.
Yeah,
that's interesting. Ooh, okay. Further, it has to be. So, if you were to do this in AnimiteTales, you can have it passive, where it starts decaying things within a small area. But if you were to touch any living object, that's when it affects them. So it's like non-living objects get affected. So in other words, it could be like floorboards, it could be paint, it could be swords, it could be clothing, where it just starts decaying, rotting, or even just starts like, as you said, gnarling, spiking, or even just starting to like just twist and turn in certain ways to show that it can never be made back into the original form ever again. And then when it comes to like living things like, grass or trees or even living creatures, It's that thing of they don't get affected yet, but the second that you touch them, that's then when it affects them, regardless of whether or
When
not
the
you've
disease
bitten them.
comes in,
Yes, yeah.
that's when the disease they just begin to feel terrible, and after a while, when you're near them, they just begin to develop cancers all over their body, or
See-
just like the bubonic plague.
That's interesting because in AnimiteTales, obviously, we have the power decay, which allows you to either rot or disintegrate objects. Having that ability, but it's like, oh, anything that is technically not this, it starts taking small amounts of damage. When I touch you, you start taking passive damage, and that is just terrifying because it's like that. It's almost like as if I reflect my own infection, my own disease starts rotting other things around it because I'm not a natural form of life. It's almost as if nature dies around me as I die with it. That is
It's
kind
like
of no go.
like when matter and antimatter meet. This is
Yes!
anti-life and life meeting.
Absolutely. It is undeath meeting life. It is unnatural life versus natural life.
Also, I've just thought as well, this could be a way of Sam to finally achieve his dream of getting a nudity ray. Because the first thing that could rot off first is the clothes.
I mean, the thing is, though, you know what the worst part is that when you're a zombie, you don't really have physical functions like that. So it'd just be okay, you're nude. I need nothing like this. You don't have hormones
I don't
anymore.
know. You can still appreciate the fall.
I know, but it's like, oh,
Human
okay,
body.
that's a thing that happened.
Anyway, as we were saying before, yes, as we were saying
be
before,
hilarious,
yes,
though.
in AnimiteTales, this power is in fact technically not a power. It is a function or something that actually can occur. So, in other words, it's kind of like an ailment or an injury, where basically a person can be resurrected using necrosis or using reanimation, and therefore they can become what is known as undead. The three main things that you should note about this is A, the user is immune to the bleed ailment, not bleed damage, meaning that someone could cause an attack that slices out something and gouges out a certain amount of blood, but it does not cause the wound to continue bleeding after the amount of blood has gashed out of them. 2, they are no longer required to eat food or sleep, so technically that's 3. And 4, they do not require oxygen. In other words, they do not need to breathe. Now, because of this, they have 2 times damage from fire, and they also have an immunity to biokinesis, which is technically an upside and a downside, because biokinesis or anything to manipulate living flesh cannot affect them. This is both an upside because that they are immune to a power, and a downside because it basically means that they cannot be healed by other people. And finally, they are immune to decay, but this also is an up and a downside. Decay is technically the form of which they heal, but decay is also a form of which they die from. This is mostly because there are 2 different powers. The power to decay, which if it can't rot, it then starts disintegrating. And the power of necrosis, which basically can heal those who have decaying flesh if they are in fact an undead. This is mostly because they can manipulate decaying flesh rather than manipulate living flesh. They can make more decaying flesh. In other words, they can... It's kind of like if I was to say I was suddenly to make the 2 of you into cyborgs, but the cybernetics were actually killing you, but the only way that you could actually keep living is if I kept giving you drugs that make sure that it staves off it, and that's the only way that you could basically have it, that both you have cybernetics and you're not dying from them. It's basically the equivalent of that. I'm an undead, and normally if I was alive, I would live from 20 years old all the way to 80 years old or something. But it's like, oh, I died at the age of 30 because you shot me or something. And it's like, yeah, I've turned you into a decaying flesh monster. I can now use necrosis to keep you alive, but you have to keep coming to me for your fix of life points. Otherwise, you'll eventually just rot and, well, that's it. So, yeah. Either way,
it's just still chronic illness. Like, it's always like, that's another thing zombification and like vampirism is kind of like metaphors for. It's like, yeah, it's like an addiction or a long-term illness that you have to keep sustaining to be quote unquote alive, or in this case, unalive.
yes.
Yeah.
There's also another particular thing which is
Amazing
actually
God.
kind of interesting, because if you touch their blood, depending on the particular type of version of them, if you touch their blood, they actually can infect you. This isn't necessarily all of them, because again, not all of them have that particular special effect, but some of them can. There's also another particular one which certain undead cannot actually activate their original powers from when they were alive. This is because that certain people who can reanimate them might not have the special ability to do so, or the reanimator must give back the free will to the user, basically meaning that they're undead, but they actually have their mind relatively intact. Again, this can only work if the brain was not severely damaged, causing their death. Any last things that you want to get out of your system before we end this podcast? Okay.
I mean,
one-
actually, there's a question that's posed by Sam in the chat here saying, so are the Puppet Master puppets physiology? Yes and no. Like, the way that I would say no for the most part, apart from a few instances where he literally does put, the Puppet Master, quote unquote, puts his consciousness into a dead body.
They are
and
souls,
keeps
aren't
going.
they? They're souls in these puppet bodies.
Okay,
Yeah,
if they are inside of flesh that was or
Yeah.
is dead and is now moving around like as if it's living, yes. If it is just inanimate objects or even stuff that was never alive to begin with, no. However,
and it all depends.
if he can do it to either, technically he has the ability to grant undead physiology to those who he stuffs their souls inside of / stuffs his own consciousness into.
And the other one was, did you say Frankenstein's monster would be an undead?
Absolutely,
Considering
100%.
He is entirely made from undead, but then he's actually alive.
Well,
he's got a heartbeat.
That's actually the funny thing, because he's technically made out of dead flesh. Theoretically, he is actually still an undead. It's just that his form of undead physiology works differently. All parts of his body are still flesh. He might have a few bits and pieces of attachment, so he's technically the equivalent of. Well, it depends on whether or not there's more metal objects in him other than those bolts sticking out of his temples.
I mean, I should say those that was from the film. The book does not have him have any metallurgical objects or metallic objects. He is
in that case
strictly
undead.
Organic bodies.
And then in that case, undead just made up of sewn together different bits and bobs, body parts, and so on and so forth. It's unnatural life because it's still from dead body parts, rather than still alive or suspended body parts. Similar, say for instance, if I were to say, "Oh, you're an undead because that you had a heart transplant with, a donor heart." That's technically not true because theoretically it was not a dead heart because it was not rotting, and your entire body was not dead because it was not rotting. It was just quote unquote clinically dead, or was not currently active until the moment of which the heart was installed. It's a very tricky thing, but I'd like to believe that this is relatively solid in the forms of how the specific power compendium, or should I say, the fandom of the Superpower Wiki has explained it.
To be honest, I did also kind of think it was a undead biology because he doesn't age as fast, at least post.
Oh, absolutely.
Post-book.
Another particular thing to remember is undead physiology doesn't necessarily mean that the user is unable to age. It just means that, in fact, they can age or they might not have to age. So either way, it doesn't really matter. The specifications of the extra factors to their powers doesn't really make too much of a difference, because obviously the main function is, are they made of dead flesh? Is their dead flesh moving? That would be in case of mimicking life. In that case, undead. Which, yeah, I think, yeah, no, absolutely. Ghouls from Fallout. No, because technically they're still alive. Their flesh is heavily damaged and irradiated. Their DNA is mutated, not dead. Because, I would say biggest reason for this is because that people don't die when they become ghouls. However, those that are resurrected by glowing ones in Fallout 4, as in the ghouls that are resurrected by the glowing one's radiation blast, I would say technically at that point they count as undead physiology. Because they were dead because you shot them point blank, killing them, and then a glowing one just goes, radiation, and then for some reason it gets back up, so...
Yeah, I was actually a bit confused because, like, ghouls don't necessarily need to breathe. Or I
They
guess
actually
can
do.
eat.
They can be
They
suffocated.
do?
Yep.
Oh, really? What about the boy in Fallout 4 where he's just trapped in a fridge or is like an air hole?
No, he can somehow breathe, although the question as to how he survived for 200 years without eating is actually up for debate. Although, to be fair, Fallout 4 does ruin quite a few of their own logics and lore. So again, technically, both of the things that we just used as an example could technically be considered debunked.
Ah, right. Damn it, Fallout 4.
Damn it, Fallout 4, why do you keep stepping on your own lore?
Let's be honest, I didn't really care for Fallout 4.
I enjoy its gameplay.
As many do.
It was acceptable.
I like messing around in it, and I guess this is about as good a time as any to sort of end this episode, purely because we've started talking about a game that came out about 5 years ago. Anyway, thank you very much for everyone who is watching this episode. This was Undead Physiology, or should I say... Undead Physiology.
I'm scared.
Spooky voice.
Either way,
October.
thank you very much for watching and listening and also subscribing and liking or disliking, depending on whether or not you learned or didn't learn anything about this video, or actually enjoyed or didn't enjoy anything about this video. Thank you very much, and thank you to Sam and Alex for joining me on a spooky night.
Bye!
See you in the future!
And, as I always say...
Ciao, ciao, for now.